After Cypress, I want to this time show the execution of the same test case with Playwright, which is another very powerful candidate for the test automation frameworks. And of course, there are some differences, like each one of them has its own strengths and weaknesses. And just a little comparison, let me quickly show what I had implemented with Playwright. It is the same test case going to Google main page and finding the text area where I can type my query and then eventually clicking the search button. So what we can right away realize is we have an await keyword here in Playwright we can use. So as you know, both Cypress and Playwright are working in an asynchronous way, which means whenever you make some async calls, you have to wait for the responses properly. So in Cypress, we don't have a chance to use await keyword, so we have to create some promises and we have to wrap for the response and then we can continue with the rest of the implementation. But in Playwright, we can just type await, so it will already wait for response to be get properly, and then we can continue. It is much more straightforward, the implementation. So this is one decision criteria we can consider, the ease of implementation. But of course, Cypress has its own strengths, like even the Cypress dashboard, which we can use for reporting the execution details, including the pass-fail criteria, the results, and all the other details. And there is one more thing I guess I forgot when I was talking about Cypress in our previous class, which was the test metadata. I think I had one slide for that in this presentation. Yeah, here. For example, whenever we add some annotations to test classes, even outside the test spec file, like even in the global hooks, before each code, we can access to that metadata. Like we can read the current suite's current test, and then what kind of annotations are added or attached to this specific test case. And if it is somehow marked with an annotation which implies that we have to skip this test, and if that condition is met, then we can just skip the relevant current test. And then we can continue with the remaining test in the same suite. So going back to the locator structure that we discussed, I think this time it will not be as long as the Cypress class because we will follow the same structure. So let me just execute the playwright so we can see how it works. Again, it is just the same steps. It's a very simple test scenario. So I think I execute this previously so I can find my last execution. So here what I'm doing is just passing the playwright test command with the relevant spec file that I want to execute, because otherwise it will try to execute all the found spec files. But I want to execute only this one. So I just passed, and oh, it was very fast, so we didn't even see the execution, but we can see the test passed. So what we can do is, of course, to not only to see the browser, but for debugging purposes, I can add another flag to my execution command. And in this way, what I will see is I have this Playwright inspector here and the browser itself as well. So what I can do is I can just step over the lines one by one. So the first, just going to the Playwright Google main page, and then the second is finding the locator. And by the way, I guess you already realized it is highlighting the element that it found even before executing the line. So I already know which locator it will interact with, and when I execute, I see that my query is typed in this text area. And then again, I see the playwright pointer here. It's very useful to understand what will happen in the next execution. So when I execute this as well, it just click the button and I'm in the results page. Wonderful. So lastly, what we can do is sometimes I have to choose the some index for the relevant child from a multiple elements found or matched with the query that we are passing, right? So what I can do is I had some notes here to use the locators with Playwright. So to narrow down our query, we can use some different attributes of the elements. For example, the text value it has, or like lots of different attributes we can use. So let's try to do that. So I'm trying to use, for example, not the class name, but I will try to find the element which has a text, which is something like this. Google search, right? Because when I go to Google page, I'm looking for this button on which I have a label, which is the Google search. So let's try. Again, I have my inspector here. Let's step over this line, continue the next, and I don't see the pointer here anymore. It couldn't find Google search. Why? Because in this browser, which was an incognito, which is not the same as I'm starting on my PC because it is triggered by a Playwright runner itself, the label is different. It's not Google search here, it's something different, which is Japanese. So let's, in the meantime, let's see how I can use the inspector here to find the element. So if I click this, I see the value that I'm looking for is this one. So let's finish this execution and let's change this. And let's start it over. What will happen now when we execute? Step over, step over. I see my pointer here now. Cool. Finish, and it just passed. So it's pretty much about playwright execution. It's very simple and straightforward. And most of the locators, we can just use this same format as Cypress. There will be some variations, there will be some custom differences, but roughly it is almost the same pattern that we can use.